David Carter, a retired high school teacher from Chicago, had earned the luxury of routine at 72. His days were predictable, simple, and peaceful. Every afternoon, he took his regular 2-block walk to Tommy's Cafe, a cozy neighborhood spot on Maple Street. Ryan, the young barista, already knew his order: black coffee, no sugar, before David even spoke. Their interactions were short but meaningful, as were the ones with the regulars who sat at the tables near the window. It was David's little haven, a slice of normalcy he had come to cherish after decades of teaching history. David always sat at the same corner by the window, coffee in hand, watching the world pass by. The chatter around him felt distant, the clinking of mugs and the whir of the espresso machine adding to the comfort of his routine. He would read the newspaper front to back, folding it neatly when finished. The time spent in the cafe was his moment to relax and recharge before heading back home. With summer temperatures creeping up in Chicago, he usually left before the heat became unbearable. But that day, something felt different. As David stepped out of Tommy's Cafe, coffee in one hand and his newspaper tucked under his arm, a low hum of unease crept into the air. The street was quieter than usual, the normal background noise of the city suddenly muted. David couldn't place it, but a nagging feeling settled in his chest. He was just a few feet from the door when a black and white squad car pulled up, the sound of its engine breaking the stillness. The car slowed to a stop directly in front of him. For a moment, David considered walking past. Maybe they weren't here for him. But then the driver's side window rolled down, and 2 officers emerged from the vehicle, moving deliberately toward him. One was young, probably in his early 20s, with a buzz cut and a rigid posture that suggested he was still finding his footing on the force. The other was older, perhaps in his mid-40s, with a broad frame and a certain authority that radiated from him. He had the kind of presence that made people listen, even when his tone was less than welcoming. "Sir, can we see some ID?" The younger officer's voice was flat, robotic. David blinked, assessing the situation. His heart didn't race. It had been here before. He knew what this was: another stop, another encounter. His father and grandfather had warned him about these moments. The world might change, but some things stay the same. Stay calm, don't escalate, don't make sudden movements. He tilted his head slightly. "Is there a problem, officers?" The older cop shifted his weight, one hand resting on his belt. "We got a call about a suspicious person matching your description," he said, his words heavy with authority. David glanced around. The sidewalk was quiet, but there were a few bystanders: a woman with a stroller, a man on a bike who had slowed their pace. The world was watching, and David couldn't help but feel the weight of their gaze. He looked down at his own clothes: khaki slacks, a button-up shirt, a neatly trimmed beard, coffee in hand. He didn't fit the description of a criminal. He barely even fit the description of someone suspicious. "You sure about that?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. The younger officer squared his shoulders, trying to appear more confident. "We just need to check your ID. Standard procedure." David knew exactly where this was going. He had 2 choices: comply and walk away, or stand his ground. He had dealt with situations like this too many times before to be intimidated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, but before he could hand over his ID, the older officer took a step forward, one hand hovering near his belt. "Stop," the older officer commanded, his tone now more forceful. "Hands on the car." David's body stiffened. He could feel the tension in the air shift. This wasn't about checking an ID anymore. This was about power, about control. His pulse quickened, but he refused to show fear. He had seen this happen too many times on the news, too many stories of men who didn't make it out of situations like this. "Can you tell me what I'm being detained for?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. The younger officer hesitated, looking to his partner, but the older officer didn't budge. "You fit the description," he repeated, as if that explained everything. David could feel the eyes of the crowd. Someone was already holding up their phone, recording. This moment was turning into something bigger, and David was ready to face it head-on. David felt the tension in the air shift, heavier now. The street noises drowned out by the rising beat of his pulse. He could sense the shift in the officers' demeanor as they closed in on him. The older cop, Mark Denny, stepped closer, his hand never far from his belt, his posture solid, a practiced ease in his movements, a signal of his authority. The younger officer, Brian Holt, remained a few steps back, his rigid stance betraying his inexperience. He was uncomfortable, unsure, but still following his partner's lead. David knew this wasn't a routine check anymore. His gut told him it had escalated, and the warning bells in his head had started to ring. He wasn't just a random man on the street anymore, he was a target. But he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattle. "You sure about this?" David asked again, his voice low, steady. The younger officer hesitated, but Mark Denny's gaze remained fixed on David. "We're following up on a call," he repeated, his tone colder now. "That's all." David glanced around again. He noticed a few more people had slowed, some curious, some watching intently. The woman with the stroller had stopped walking, her eyes flicking nervously between the officers and David. The man on the bike was now standing a few feet away, his phone subtly raised, camera aimed in their direction. "Suspicious," David muttered under his breath. His hands were still visible, resting at his sides, though his nerves were starting to tighten. The older cop's aggressive posture, the way he kept edging closer, made his intentions clear. David had been stopped like this before, but something felt different this time. "You have any weapons?" Brian Holt asked, still standing behind his partner, though his voice now had a slight tremor to it. David exhaled slowly. "Do I look like I have a weapon?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. The absurdity of it all made him feel both exhausted and angry. He turned his head to face the younger officer. "Is this really happening?" Brian glanced at Mark, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was clear now that Mark was in charge. He was the one calling the shots, and Brian was simply following his lead, even if it was becoming increasingly obvious that this situation was spiraling out of control. David kept his gaze fixed on the younger officer. "You sure about this?" he asked again, his voice calm but sharp. The crowd had grown slightly, people standing a few feet away, observing but not intervening. Some had their phones raised, capturing everything. This wasn't just another routine stop. This was a moment that would be seen by others, maybe even the world. Mark Denny seemed unfazed, though. His eyes narrowed, and his voice became more forceful. "Just cooperate, and you'll be on your way," he said, like he had said it 100 times before to someone just like David. The subtext was clear: comply, or things could get worse. David's frustration simmered beneath the surface, but he kept himself in check. He knew all too well how easily situations like this could escalate. His hands twitched, and his mind raced, but he remained still. He had seen too many stories end tragically after a simple stop. Too many times had he watched the news, seen another man, another black man, forced to the ground, restrained, or worse, because of a mistake, a misunderstanding. "I don't resist. I don't fight. I don't run," David had told his daughter Emily countless times growing up. He told her that these were the rules, the survival instincts they both had to live by. But right now, that rule felt heavy in his chest. The weight of it all was too much. Suddenly, David made a decision. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He knew what it meant. He could feel the shift in the air as both officers tensed. Mark's hands shot up, his expression hardening. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered, his voice now a little more desperate. David didn't flinch. He held the phone up slowly, his movements measured. "I'm calling my daughter," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. Brian Holt looked confused for a moment, his brow furrowed. "Sir, just." David pressed the number, the one he knew by heart. His thumb hovered over the screen as it rang, 2 rings, then 3. Before Emily picked up, "Hey, Dad, what's wrong?" Emily's voice was sharp, controlled. She could always tell when something wasn't right. David allowed himself to take a deep breath for the first time in what felt like forever. He felt a sense of relief. He'd made the call, she was on the other end, and things were about to change. "Just outside Tommy's cafe," David said, his eyes still locked on the officers. "They stopped me. They're questioning me for no reason." David stood there, phone in hand, watching the 2 officers closely. The older one, Mark Denny, had yet to make a move, but his face had hardened, his posture tightening as if bracing for a confrontation. The younger officer, Brian Holt, was less certain, shifting uneasily from foot to foot, his gaze darting between David and the crowd. The tension in the air was thick now, the weight of the moment almost palpable. And in that silence, David let the phone ring, 1, 2, 3 rings. Finally, Emily answered, and hearing her voice on the other end was like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. "Hey, Dad, what's wrong?" Emily's voice was sharp, focused, the kind of tone she always used when things were about to get serious. David felt a wave of relief wash over him. She was there. She always had his back, and now he had to make sure she had theirs. "They stopped me, Em. They won't let me go," David said, his eyes never leaving the officers. The words left his mouth quietly, but with the kind of steel that comes from years of experience, years of being told to stay calm and don't escalate. But this time, it felt different. This time, he wasn't alone. "They've got no reason to be stopping me." A moment of silence passed. David could almost hear the wheels turning in his daughter's mind, her sharp, strategic brain already processing everything, already calculating the next move. He could picture her face, brows furrowed in concentration, probably already thinking about how to handle this on a larger scale. "What's your location?" Emily asked, her voice now steady and commanding. She wasn't asking, she was directing. "Just outside Tommy's cafe on Maple," David replied, his voice tight but even. "Stay on the line." "I'm putting you on speaker," Emily instructed, her tone now unmistakably authoritative. David felt a surge of pride in his chest. His daughter wasn't just any lawyer, she was one of the highest-ranking officials in the U.S. Department of Justice, and she wasn't going to let this go. She wouldn't let them push him around. As Emily's voice crackled through the speaker, clear and unwavering, the atmosphere around them shifted. The younger officer, Brian, who had been unsure of himself only moments before, now looked even more uncertain, his eyes flickering to Mark for guidance. But Mark wasn't looking at him anymore, his eyes were fixed on the phone in David's hand. "This is Emily Carter, U.S. Attorney General," Emily's voice spoke through the air, cool and controlled. "I'm speaking to Officer Mark Denny and Officer Brian Holt." "Who am I speaking to?" David could feel the air grow still. The crowd, which had been quietly gathering, seemed to hold its collective breath. It was as if they, too, knew that this moment was about to turn into something far bigger than a simple police stop. Mark Denny's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak immediately. Brian Holt took an instinctive step back, his body language defensive now, as if trying to distance himself from what had just escalated. They both knew who Emily Carter was. They didn't have to be told. For a moment, there was silence. David, who had been holding his breath, exhaled slowly, never looking away from the officers. Emily's tone cut through that silence like a blade. "You are currently detaining my father, a 72-year-old man, without cause. I expect an immediate and clear explanation." The words landed heavily. The crowd, which had been passive until now, seemed to shift. Someone in the back of the group muttered something under their breath, but David didn't take his eyes off the officers. They were rattled. The shift in power was instant, and the officers knew it. The younger officer swallowed hard, glancing nervously at his partner. We got a call about a suspicious person matching his description," Brian stammered, clearly uncomfortable. Emily didn't let him finish. What was suspicious about him? Her voice was calm but held an undeniable authority, the kind of authority that made people listen. Was he committing a crime? Was he a threat? There was a pause. The officers hesitated, their uncertainty hanging in the air like a fog. The crowd was beginning to murmur, phones still raised, capturing everything. Someone in the back, a woman in a navy blazer, had already started taking video. A young man, his earbuds hanging loosely from his neck, stood there, recording as well. The moment was shifting, and David could feel the eyes of the world on them, even if the world hadn't fully realized it yet. Brian Holt looked to his partner, waiting for direction, but Mark Denny was no longer the confident figure he had been just minutes before. His face had gone from firm to defensive, and David could see the realization dawning on him that this was spiraling out of his control. Mark swallowed, his voice suddenly more measured. "If it was a misunderstanding," he muttered, his gaze shifting to the crowd that had gathered. He was trying to backpedal, to get the situation under control, but it was too late. The officers had made their move, and now the world was watching. David's grip tightened on the phone, but he didn't flinch. He had done his part. Emily was already on it, the crowd had already seen enough, and the story, whether the officers liked it or not, was already unfolding. The moment was frozen in time. For a brief second, the world seemed to stop as the silence thickened. The officers stood there, caught in the weight of their own actions, unsure of what to do next. The crowd around them, previously passive, was now stirred. People were recording, watching, and waiting. The tension in the air was palpable, and the officers knew they had lost control. David stood still, calm, his eyes never leaving the officers. His hand still held the phone up, the speaker on, and Emily's voice, clear and unwavering, echoed through the quiet street. "Am I free to go?" David's voice broke through the stillness, his question simple but heavy. He wasn't looking for an argument, he was just demanding a clear answer. The crowd around them was growing, the curiosity spreading like wildfire. More people had stopped. A man in a mechanic's jumpsuit had pulled his phone from his pocket, recording every move. A woman in a navy blazer, her face set in disbelief, was speaking softly to someone beside her, her phone still raised. They were witnesses now, part of the growing audience that was witnessing this clash between David and the officers. The younger officer, Brian Holt, shifted on his feet, his eyes flickering between David and his partner. Mark Denny, the older officer, remained stoic but visibly uncomfortable. The shift in power had been too swift. Emily Carter's presence, even over the phone, had turned the tide. David was no longer just a man in the street, someone who could be intimidated or pushed aside. Now, he was someone with power behind him, someone who could not be so easily dismissed. And that power wasn't just his daughter's position, though that had undoubtedly given the officers pause. It was the collective power of the crowd, the cameras, the truth being laid bare in front of them. "I told you," David said, his voice low but firm. "I don't resist. I don't fight. But I won't be pushed around." Mark Denny glanced at Brian again, his frustration now boiling to the surface. His hand hovered near his belt, the movement so slight it was almost imperceptible, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. Brian Holt cleared his throat. "Sir, we're just doing our job." David's eyes narrowed. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass, not to make assumptions about people based on the way they look or the color of their skin." The younger officer recoiled slightly at David's words, his uncertainty deepening. He wasn't trained for this kind of confrontation. Mark Denny, on the other hand, wasn't as easily rattled, but even he could feel the gravity of the moment. He had misjudged the situation, and now the consequences were unfolding right before him. The crowd had started murmuring, a ripple of voices that made it clear this wasn't just about David anymore. This was about something larger, something that had been building for years. The eyes of the world weren't just on them, they were on the entire system that allowed moments like this to happen, and they were waiting for an answer. David exhaled slowly, letting the moment sink in. The police had overstepped, and now they were left with no excuse. The power had shifted, and the officers were no longer in control. David wasn't just walking away from this, he was standing his ground, letting them know that he wouldn't let them erase his dignity. Mark Denny finally spoke, his voice reluctant, clipped. "You're free to go, sir." David didn't move immediately. He let the words hang in the air. He wanted them to understand. He wanted them to know that their authority had been stripped away in that moment. The power they thought they had wasn't real, it was fragile, built on the illusion of control, and today, they had lost it. For a moment, everything held still. The crowd was silent, phones still aimed at the officers, recording the quiet aftermath. It wasn't just a win for David, it was a win for everyone who had ever been stopped, intimidated, or made to feel less than human by those who were supposed to protect them. David turned slowly, his posture relaxed but purposeful, and walked away. His steps were measured, not hurried. He was walking away on his own terms, not theirs. As he moved away from the officers, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't need to check it, he already knew who it was, Emily. She had seen it all, heard it all, and now the world would see, too. "Thanks, Em," David whispered to himself, his voice almost a sigh, but it carried with it a sense of relief, a sense of victory. The officers stood frozen behind him, their jaws clenched, their fists at their sides. There was nothing left for them to do. The moment had passed, and it had passed in a way that would change everything. David walked slowly, the crowd's murmurs trailing behind him, the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. He didn't look back. There was nothing left to say, nothing more to prove. The officers remained standing, frozen, their faces red with frustration and embarrassment, while the people who had witnessed the scene were already beginning to disperse, their phones still held up, capturing the last remnants of the encounter. As David reached the corner of the block, his phone buzzed again. He didn't need to check the screen, he knew who it was, Emily. She'd be watching, following the story unfold. David had no doubt the video was already circulating, making its way across social media, where it would spread like wildfire. This time, the world was paying attention. He answered the call, his voice calm but weary. "I'm heading home, Em." "You did good, Dad," Emily's voice came through, steady and proud, but David could hear the underlying concern. "The video is already online. It's getting traction fast. People are angry. They're not letting it go." David nodded, though she couldn't see it. He had known this moment would come. He had lived long enough to understand the way things worked, how they always seemed to cycle back, how people would be outraged for a few days, then let it fade into the background. But this time, there was something different about the way it felt. "How bad is it?" he asked, his fingers drumming lightly on the phone. "Bad for them," Emily replied. "The public is already demanding answers. It's not just the usual outrage. It's spreading fast." David sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in. "They'll issue a statement," he said, his voice flat, resigned. "Talk about procedures and reviews, but there won't be any real accountability." "Exactly," Emily agreed, her voice firm. "We both know how this goes. But it's different this time. People aren't just sharing it, they're demanding action." David paused, his mind still running through the events of the afternoon, the officers' attitudes, the shift in power when Emily stepped in. It had all happened so fast, and yet it felt like something had finally broken in the system. It wasn't just his fight. It wasn't just his moment. It was a sign of something bigger. The world had seen what happened, and now they were waiting for answers. "I know," David said quietly, "but it's still not enough." "Not yet." Emily didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. She knew what he meant. The fight wasn't over just because the officers let him go. They had to be held accountable, and more than that, things had to change. He couldn't just walk away thinking it was done. No, this was only the beginning. As David walked through his front door, he felt a strange combination of exhaustion and purpose. His legs ached from the walk, but his mind was still racing. The news had already broken. Local stations were running the footage, the crowd, the officers, his daughter's intervention. The footage was raw, real, and it wasn't going to be easy to ignore. He sank into his favorite armchair by the window, watching the familiar streets outside. The neighborhood hadn't changed, but something in the air felt different, the silence before a storm. David knew the world was watching, and it wasn't going to forget what happened on Lincoln Avenue. His phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a message from an old colleague, a retired professor who had seen the video. The message was short but filled with conviction. "Proud of you. This had to happen." David stared at the message for a moment, unsure of what to feel. Proud, maybe, but he wasn't sure that was the word he was looking for. It wasn't about pride. It was about doing what needed to be done. It was about standing up, speaking out, and ensuring that things didn't continue as they always had. The knock on the surgery, soft, but David knew who it was before he opened it. Emily stood there, arms crossed, looking him over like she was checking for any hidden wounds. She had flown in, of course she had. "You didn't have to come," David said as he stepped aside to let her in. "I know," she replied, giving him a knowing look, "but you don't think I'd miss this, do you?" They sat together in the living room, the TV murmuring in the background as the anchors discussed the incident. News clips replayed the video from different angles, showing the officers, the crowd, and the moment the power shifted. It was everywhere now, on news channels, social media, in people's conversations. The conversation had already begun, but David knew the real work had just started. Emily rubbed her temple, her exhaustion starting to show. "They'll try to spin it, issue the usual statements, but we can't let them get away with it." David nodded, glancing out the window at the neighbors who had gathered in front of their houses, some talking to reporters, others just watching, waiting. The message was clear: this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was everyone's. "They won't forget," David said with a small smile. "Not this time." Emily leaned back, looking at her father with a mix of admiration and determination. "Then let's make sure of it." David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've always been the stubborn one." "I get that from you," Emily replied, a rare smile tugging at her lips. "Now, let's get to work." David took a slow sip from his coffee, feeling the weight of everything he had done and everything that was to come. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: the world wasn't turning away from this one, and neither was he.